20,000 Saiga antelope left on Earth in 2004, a 90% collapse in barely a decade. But what nobody knew at the time was that this silent Kazakh steppe, which looked exactly like a graveyard, was about to become the site of the greatest large mammal recovery in recorded history. The Saiga antelope's nose is enormous, bulbous, trunk-like, but it's a biological masterpiece, filtering steppe dust in summer and warming freezing air in winter. The species survived the last ice age alongside woolly mammoths. By 2004, it was nearly gone. This didn't happen by accident, it happened by design. 30 years before the 2004 crisis point, the Saiga population was measured in the millions. Soviet-era rangers patrolled the steppe with real authority, and enforcement, however imperfect, held the worst poaching in check. That was a different world entirely. Then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and almost overnight, that enforcement system dissolved. Border controls weakened, government agencies lost funding. Rangers who had once patrolled remote steppe regions went unpaid or disappeared entirely. The legal architecture that had protected the Saiga for decades simply ceased to function. And into that vacuum walked a market force that proved catastrophic. Saiga horn had always held value in traditional Asian medicine, but through the early 1990s, rhino horn had dominated that market. As international pressure mounted against rhino poaching and rhino populations crashed across Africa and Asia, buyers began looking for alternatives. Saiga horn, chemically similar in certain applications and far more abundant, surged in value. Traders in China, South Korea, and across Southeast Asia began sourcing it aggressively. The same open steppe that had allowed millions of Saiga to roam freely for millennia had become the landscape where they were being systematically hunted to nothing. The same freedom that defined the species was being used to destroy it. The same poaching economy that built its profits on Saiga abundance was about to destroy it, because eventually, even the most profitable harvest runs out of animals to kill. What made the poaching particularly devastating wasn't just the volume. It was the biology. Only male Saiga carry horns. Poachers targeted males almost exclusively because females were commercially worthless to them. The result was a sex ratio collapse that compounded the mortality crisis. In a healthy Saiga herd, roughly one male can service multiple females, and the species breeds fast. But when males become so scarce that females can't find mates during the brief breeding window, reproductive output crashes even harder than the raw death toll suggests. By the late 1990s, surveys were finding herds where males represented less than 3% of the population. 3%. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. The scale of the collapse, when you lay the numbers out, is almost incomprehensible. In the 1970s, the total Saiga population across Kazakhstan was estimated at roughly 1 million animals, possibly more. By 1990, as the Soviet system began to crack, numbers were already declining. By 1995, the population had dropped to somewhere around 200,000. By the year 2000, it had fallen below 100,000. And by 2004, official surveys counted approximately 20,000 animals remaining. That is a decline of over 90% in less than 15 years. An entire species, one that had survived the Pleistocene extinction event, nearly wiped out in a single human generation by commercial poaching. The word that started appearing in scientific and government documents around. This time was not endangered, it was extinction. The International Union for Conservation of Nature listed the Saiga as critically endangered. Conservation organizations that had been monitoring the situation for years began using language that reflected genuine despair. This was not a species in trouble, this was a species in free fall, and the trajectory pointed in one direction only. The failure to treat the post-Soviet enforcement collapse as an immediate conservation emergency in the early 1990s cost the Saiga roughly a decade of potential recovery time. Every year of inaction between 1991 and the early 2000s allowed the poaching networks to become more organized, more profitable, and more deeply embedded in the regional economy. Picture a government minister in Astana in the early 2000s, sitting across from a stack of survey reports showing 20,000 animals, not 20,000 in one region, 20,000 total, on the entire steppe. The number lands differently when you're the person responsible for the country where it happened. Kazakhstan's government had been aware of the Saiga crisis through the 1990s. Awareness and action are different things. What changed in the early 2000s was a combination of internet pressure and domestic political will arriving at the same moment. conservation organizations including the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds through its BirdLife International Network, and the Frankfurt Zoological Society had been building relationships with Kazakh scientists and officials for years. By 2002 and 2003, those relationships began producing concrete policy commitments. The first and most urgent intervention was anti-poaching enforcement. Kazakhstan deployed mobile ranger units to remote steppe regions that had effectively been ungoverned for a decade. These weren't token patrols. They were coordinated operations targeting the supply chain. The hunters in the field, the middlemen moving horn across borders, and the traders connecting to Asian markets. Penalties for Saiga horn possession and trade were increased significantly. Cross-border cooperation with customs agencies was formalized. The message from the Kazakh government was unambiguous: a national emergency treated as one. The biological insight that the conservationists' genuine hope was rooted in Saiga reproductive biology. The species is extraordinarily fecund by ungulate standards. Females typically reach sexual maturity at around 8 months of age. They can birth twins annually, meaning a single female can produce 2 offspring per year under good conditions. The math of that reproductive rate is powerful. If you can reduce adult mortality enough, and if you can restore a functional sex ratio so that breeding actually occurs, the population has the biological capacity to double in just a few years. The problem had never been the Saiga's ability to recover. The problem had been that mortality was so high and the sex ratio so distorted that reproduction couldn't keep pace. Fix the mortality, fix the ratio, let the biology do the rest. International partners brought resources that the Kazakh government couldn't supply alone. Funding from European conservation organizations helped pay for ranger salaries, vehicles, and equipment in regions where government budgets were still recovering from the post-Soviet fiscal collapse. Scientific institutions provided aerial survey technology and methodology, allowing for systematic population counts across vast transects of steppe that would have been impossible to assess accurately on the ground. Researchers from the Saiga Conservation Alliance, a coalition of scientists and NGOs formed specifically around this crisis, began producing the kind of rigorous data that governments need to justify sustained investment. Perhaps the most underrated element of the turnaround was a shift in political framing. Through the 1990s, Saiga had been treated primarily as a wildlife management problem, something for biologists and rangers to worry about. In the early 2000s, Kazakh officials began recasting the Saiga as a symbol of national heritage, a uniquely Kazakh animal whose survival or extinction would reflect directly on Kazakhstan as a nation. That framing change mattered enormously for enforcement culture. Rangers who understood they were protecting a national symbol behaved differently than rangers who understood they were filing paperwork about livestock. A Saiga went from being a line item in a conservation budget to being a point of national pride. And that shift, quiet and bureaucratic as it sounds, changed what was politically possible. Somewhere on the central Kazakh steppe in the mid-2000s, a small team of conservationists, Kazakh government officials, and international scientists sat down to sketch out something far more ambitious than a species rescue plan. They were designing a landscape. The Altyn Dala Conservation Initiative launched around 2005 and 2006, built on a partnership between Kazakhstan's Forestry and Wildlife, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Frankfurt Zoological Society, among other partners. The name itself was a statement of intent. Altyn Dala means golden steppe in Kazakh, not a species rescue program, not an anti-poaching initiative. Golden steppe. The ambition embedded in that name was clear: restore the entire ecosystem, not just pull one species back from the edge. The scope of what was broken extended well beyond the Saiga population numbers. Decades of Soviet agricultural expansion, followed by post-Soviet land abandonment, and then renewed development pressure, had fragmented the steppe in ways that were invisible from the ground, but catastrophic from the air. Roads cut across migration corridors. Fences divided calving grounds from wintering areas. Agricultural fields blocked ancient movement routes that Saiga had used for thousands of years. Restoring the Saiga, without restoring the landscape they needed to move through, would have been like repairing a river by filling it with water while leaving the dam in place. Altyn Dala addressed it by working to create and expand protected areas specifically designed around Saiga biology. Calving grounds, the places where females aggregate in enormous numbers to give birth in late spring, received priority protection. Migration corridors between seasonal ranges were mapped and, where possible, secured. Water sources critical to survival in the steppe interior were identified and protected. The goal was a connected network of habitat, not isolated islands of protection surrounded by hostile landscape. Community integration was built into the model from the beginning. Local people living in and around the steppe had been part of the poaching economy, often out of economic necessity rather than indifference to conservation. Altyn Dala created pathways for those same people to become part of the conservation economy. Local men were hired and trained as rangers, giving them a salary, a role, and a direct economic stake in Saiga survival. In 2009, conservationists would understand exactly what this meant, that the difference between a program that collapses when international funding dries up and one that endures is whether the local community has a reason to keep it alive. The aerial survey program deserves particular attention because it became the nervous system of the entire recovery effort. Every spring, fixed-wing aircraft flew systematic transects across the steppe, counting animals, mapping distribution, and tracking population trends. These weren't casual flyovers. They were rigorous scientific surveys producing statistically robust estimates that could be compared year over year. That data feedback loop was what allowed managers to know whether what they were doing was working and to adjust when it wasn't. Conservation without monitoring is flying blind. Altyn Dala made sure it could see. The Saiga's reproductive biology, which had been the source of so much despair when poaching was overwhelming it, now became the engine of something extraordinary. With adult mortality finally dropping, with the sex ratio recovering as male poaching declined, and with calving grounds protected during the most vulnerable weeks of the year, the population began to climb. Because the numbers started coming back from the aerial surveys weren't just encouraging, they were stunning. By 2013, the Saiga was still officially listed as critically endangered, and rightly so. The population remained fragile, the threats hadn't disappeared, and the memory of 20,000 animals was still recent enough to keep scientists cautious. But the trend line had definitively reversed. Every annual survey was showing more animals than the last. Trajectory that had pointed toward extinction was now pointing in the opposite direction, and it was accelerating. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did, because by 2014 and 2015, the Betpak Dala and Ural populations together crossed a threshold that would have seemed delusional a decade earlier. Kazakhstan Saiga population reached 1 million animals. 1 million from 20,000 in 2004 to 1 million in roughly a decade. That is not a gradual recovery. That is a biological explosion. And it happened because the conditions that had been suppressing the population for 15 years were finally removed. The numbers kept climbing. By the time the 2024 aerial surveys were completed, the count came back at 2.83 million Saiga across Kazakhstan's steppe. That represented a 48% increase in a single year, a figure so large that it required double checking. And then in April 2025, the spring surveys produced a number that placed the Saiga recovery in a category entirely its own. The population had reached between 3.9 and 4.1 million animals. Kazakhstan Saiga now represented over 98% of the entire global Saiga population. The species that conservationists had been writing extinction documents about in 2004 was now, in terms of raw numbers, one of the great wildlife success stories in modern history. The science behind the speed of recovery is worth understanding. Saiga can double their population in as few as 3 to 5 years under favorable conditions, a rate that is exceptional among large mammals. Most large ungulates, bison, elephants, rhinos recover slowly because their reproductive rates are low. Saiga are different. The same biology that made the sex ratio distortion so catastrophic during the collapse made the recovery so rapid once the pressure lifted. The species was always capable of this, it just needed the killing to stop. The Betpak Dala herd, the largest of the 3 subpopulations, drove most of the numerical recovery. Its calving grounds in central Kazakhstan, now protected under the Altyn Dala framework, became the engine of the rebound. Spring surveys over those calving aggregations began producing images that looked like nothing so much as the Serengeti. Hundreds of thousands of animals gathered in one place, the steppe alive in a way it hadn't been in living memory. 4 million animals. Central Kazakhstan, the spring of 2025. In May 2015, a researcher flying a survey transect over the Dala calving grounds looked down and saw something that took a moment to process. Animals were lying down, thousands of them, not resting, dead. The same calving aggregation that had been producing record counts was producing record casualties, and the cause wasn't poaching, it was disease. The mass mortality event of 2015 killed an estimated 200,000 Saiga in a matter of weeks. The culprit was Pastorella multocida, a bacterium that lives harmlessly in the respiratory tracts of healthy animals, but can turn lethal under specific physiological stress conditions. Scientists later determined that unusual weather patterns, warm and humid conditions during the calving period, triggered the bacterium to become invasive, spreading from the nasal passages into the bloodstream and causing rapid organ failure. Entire herds were affected. Females that had gathered in their tens of thousands to give birth died alongside their newborns. The images from the steppe that spring were among the most disturbing in the history of wildlife conservation. The cruel irony was biological. The same behavior that made Saiga so good at recovering, the dense calving aggregations where thousands of females give birth in the same place at the same time, flooding the area with vulnerable newborns faster than predators can consume them, also created perfect conditions for explosive disease transmission. Pack enough animals into a small enough area, add a stress trigger, and a bacterium that was harmless becomes a catastrophe. Kazakh authorities and conservation partners were forced to develop rapid response protocols that hadn't existed before. Field veterinary teams were deployed to the steppe during calving season. Carcass removal programs were organized to reduce disease load in affected areas. Surveillance systems were upgraded to detect unusual mortality patterns earlier. The 2015 event was followed by smaller die-offs in subsequent years, each one requiring the same mobilization of resources and the same difficult decisions about intervention versus observation. What the data makes clear is that these die-offs did not reverse the overall trajectory. The population absorbed the losses and continued growing. The 2015 event killed roughly a third of the Dala herd. By the following survey, numbers were recovering. By 2024, the population had reached nearly 3 million. The die-offs were devastating in the moment, but the reproductive engine of the species was powerful enough to absorb them. The lesson embedded in this chapter of the story is one that conservation science is still working through. Managing a recovered species is a completely different challenge than saving an endangered one. The tools that work at 20,000 animals, enforcement, protection, monitoring, don't automatically scale to 2 million. New vulnerabilities emerge. Disease dynamics change at high density. The politics of success become as complicated as the politics of crisis. Success, it turns out, creates its own set of problems. A wheat farmer in northern Kazakhstan in 2019 woke up to find his fields destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. A herd of several thousand Saiga had moved through overnight, trampling the crop, competing with his livestock for grazing, and leaving behind nothing he could sell. He called the local agricultural office. The agricultural office called the Wildlife Authority. The Wildlife Authority explained that the Saiga was a protected species. The real question is what happened behind closed doors. Because the political conversation happening inside Kazakhstan's government at this point was not the celebratory one that international conservation organizations were having. It was a much harder conversation about who pays for conservation success. Rural communities in northern and western Kazakhstan, where Saiga herds were now moving in numbers not seen in decades, we're experiencing real economic losses. Cereal crops trampled, grazing land competed for, fences broken, water sources fouled. These weren't abstract costs. They were the difference between a profitable season and a failing one for families operating on thin margins. The tension between local landowners bearing the cost of conservation and national and international interests celebrating the comeback became increasingly acute through the late 2010s and early 2020s. Farmers demanded compensation. Some demanded population control. The Kazakh government found itself caught between its international commitments to Saiga conservation and its domestic obligations to rural constituents who had never asked to host a wildlife recovery on their farmland, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. But Kazakhstan chose to bring attention to the international stage rather than resolve it quietly through uncontrolled culling. In 2025, Kazakhstan submitted a proposal to CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, arguing for a reclassification that would allow tightly controlled, sustainable use of saiga, including a regulated horn harvest. The argument was straightforward. If local communities can derive economic benefit from saiga, they will protect them. If saiga represent only cost and damage, the political will to protect them will erode. The proposal was contentious, and the conservation community was divided, but Kazakhstan's position was grounded in the same pragmatism that had made the recovery possible in the first place. The ecotourism angle emerging alongside this debate may offer a longer-term resolution. Kazakhstan's steppe migrations, now numbering in the millions of animals, are beginning to attract the kind of international attention that the Serengeti commands. Wildlife photographers, documentary filmmakers, and ecotourists are starting to arrive in numbers that generate real revenue. The comparison to African migrations is not hyperbole. A herd of 3 to 4 million animals moving across open grassland is one of the great wildlife spectacles on Earth, and Kazakhstan has it. The economic model that shifts local communities from conflict with saiga to coexistence with saiga is not yet fully built, but the foundations are visible. The Ustyurt Plateau population tells a different story. Border fences, gas pipelines, and industrial infrastructure have severed migration routes the Ustyurt saiga used for millennia. No enforcement or protected area designation has restored what two sovereign legal systems and decades of development have broken. Conservationists are now asking whether the tools that worked on open steppes are enough when the problem is connectivity across sovereign borders. The answer so far is not yet. When you put this all together, what Kazakhstan built over 2 decades is not a conservation success story. It is a blueprint. Enforcement that actually reduced mortality, protected areas that preserved the habitat engine, and a monitoring system that told managers what was happening in real time. 3 things. Applied consistently, long enough for the biology to respond. The steppe that looked like a graveyard in 2004 is now home to 4 million animals. The same grassland, the same species, a different set of decisions. If you want to see what comes next, subscribe and you will catch the next recovery story before it disappears.